children. This is Mrs. Day, and today's mini lesson is on commas. 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 I see my students misusing commas all the time, and I think the reason is that when you're taught to read out loud when you're a little kid, you're taught to take a pause when you see a comma. That is correct. However, it doesn't work the other way around. So you can't, as a writer, you can't just put in a comma every time you think there should be a pause. I wanted to come up with some simple, workable rules for you guys for commas. These rules are going to make your writing better and cleaner and maybe most importantly, correct. Now some of you are thinking like, hey, isn't comma usage kind of a style thing? Yes, comma usage is a matter of style, and you're going to see a lot of famous authors using commas incorrectly, frankly. But the problem is you can't use punctuation incorrectly and just say it's your style until you're Hemingway or Virginia Woolf. And when you're Hemingway or Virginia Woolf, play around with the commas all you want. Use my rules now to make your writing correct, and then as you develop as a writer, you can start to play with comma usage as a matter of style. Note, these are not all the rules for commas. These are 9 rules that address most of the common mistakes that I see my kids making. So let's get started. All right, so the first rule for commas is you use commas when listing things. You may have heard that commas are for lists of more than 3 things. Honestly, I just think my rule is simpler. Use a comma when listing things. Basically, you use a comma when listing anything if you could put an and or an or in that same place. So here's an example. I gave myself a shopping spree at the mall for my birthday. I went to Sephora, GameStop, and Foot Locker. Yeah, I have varied interests. What? Read the last sentence again. I went to Sephora, comma, GameStop, comma, and Foot Locker. Now, yes, I could have said I went to Sephora and GameStop and Foot Locker, but that's weird, right? It sounds clunky. So we use commas instead. Now, this rule goes for using nouns or adjectives. Here's an example with adjectives. I felt like a free, fun-loving millionaire. Again, I could have said free and fun-loving, but I didn't. I used a comma. I felt like a free, fun-loving millionaire. One more example. If you're listing multiple things, the national flag of the Philippines is red, white, blue, and yellow. Red, comma, white, comma, blue, comma, and yellow. Now, I know there are some language-loving nerds among you saying, hey, what about the Oxford comma, Mrs. Day? What about the Oxford comma, Mrs. Day? I know. I want to do a whole video that's just about the Oxford comma, but I didn't want to take up that time here. So for those of you who already know what I'm talking about, Mrs. Day says use the Oxford comma. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, tune in for a later video. So that's rule number 1, use a comma when listing things. Rule number 2, use a comma after introductory words, phrases, or clauses. This is a rule I see my students breaking all the time, and it's a really easy one to get right. An introduction in a sentence is just like an introduction in an essay. It sets the tones for the sentence, or it gives background information for the sentence. Introductory words are going to be things like firstly, well, or also. Introductory phrases are things like in addition. If you're using an introductory word, phrase, or clause in your sentence, you put a comma after that introduction. Here are some examples. Firstly, this sentence has an introductory word. Get it? Firstly is the introductory word. So firstly, comma, this sentence has an introductory word. In addition, this sentence has an introductory phrase, comma, after the introduction, which is in addition. You may be thinking this sentence won't have an introductory clause, but it does. So that whole first part, the setting up or the introduction to the sentence, is your introductory clause. You may be thinking this sentence won't have an introductory clause, comma, but it does. Now you can also hear that this is one of those cases where you can put a comma where a natural pause would occur. Rule number 3, use a pair of commas to set apart information that isn't essential to a sentence. So these are going to be clauses, phrases, or words that you could theoretically take out of the sentence without changing the sentence's essential meaning. The information inside the commas is important, but it's not necessary for the sentence to make sense. Let me show you an example. The Harry Potter series, my all-time favorite, features many strong female characters. Now, if a snowy owl came along and took out the part in between the commas, I would still have a complete sentence. Look, the Harry Potter series features many strong female characters. So if you're ever unsure where those commas should go, think about what you can take out of a sentence while still having a complete sentence, and that'll tell you. Here's another example. Zadie, the best student in our class, broke the curve on last week's test. Again, the two commas indicate the part of the sentence that, if removed, would not alter the fact that I still have a sentence. Zadie broke the curve on last week's test. That additional information about Zadie being the best student isn't essential for the sentence to make sense. One more. The great white shark, a huge fish, makes long-distance journeys around the globe. They're my two little commas. Please, please, please make sure that you have two commas when you do this. Make sure you have a pair of commas. It's almost physically painful to see students writing when they have one of these commas and not the other. Rule number 4, use a comma to join sentences together that use for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. Here's my example. Sammy loved the pizza, but hated sharing it with her little brother. Now see, that could have been two separate sentences. Sammy loved the pizza, Sammy hated sharing it with her little brother, but since I join them together with that conjunction but, I use a comma. Sammy loved the pizza, comma, but hated sharing it with her brother. Here's another. Sammy ate every bite and even licked her plate. Can you see how those could have been two different sentences? You put them together. I used a conjunction, so I need a comma. Rule number 5, use a comma to separate dependent clauses from independent ones. This video is not supposed to be about grammar and grammar terms, but to explain this rule, I need to include a quick reminder. A clause is a part of a sentence that has its own subject and verb. A dependent clause is a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence because it needs another clause to make sense. I think this will make more sense if you see it. Here's your example. While I was home last night, I learned a new song on my guitar. Can you see that while I was home last night is a dependent clause? It needs the rest of the sentence to make sense. It isn't complete without it. I learned a new song on my guitar is independent. If I take it away, I'm left with while I was home last night, and that's not a sentence. That's not a complete sentence. It's dependent on I learned a new song on my guitar. So when I combined the dependent clause with the independent one, I put a comma in between the two. I'll show you another one. I finally finished my history fair project after weeks of work. Again, a comma joining this time first an independent clause with a dependent clause. If I remove that independent clause, I'm left with after weeks of work. That's not a sentence. It doesn't have a subject. It doesn't have a verb, its own subject and verb, so it's dependent on the rest of it. I finally finished my history fair project after weeks of work. Rule number 6, use a comma before a quotation. This one is easy, and we use it a lot in class writing. This is a rule, too, that is really going to set your writing apart from other middle schoolers. It's going to show that you know how to use language well, and it's going to impress the people who are reading your writing. Here are a couple of examples. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness," comma, then the quotation. Douglas Adams wrote, "A common mistake that people make when trying to design something completely foolproof is to underestimate the ingenuity of complete fools," comma, then the quotation. Mrs. Day always says, "Man, my students are awesome." By the way, I want to do a whole video on quotations, but just notice here that the end punctuation in each sentence comes inside the quotation marks. The quotation marks are like little arms that hug the punctuation inside. Rule number 7, always use commas on dates, place names, and after a greeting in a letter. I don't actually know. Is this one rule? Is this 3? I don't know. These may not, and actually they don't, follow the rules of grammar that we've talked about so far, but they're just standards of English grammar. Just use them. Just use them. Here are 2 dates. September 25th, 1981, December 7th, 1941. The comma goes in between the day and the year. When you're doing place names, the comma goes in between the city and the state, or the city and the country, like Detroit, comma, Michigan, or Seoul, comma, South Korea. And at the beginning of a letter, you always use a comma after your greeting. So, Dear John, comma, or to whom it may concern, comma. These are just standard usages. Use them every time. Rule number 8, use a comma to indicate an interjection. Here's another grammar term for you. An interjection is a spoken word, phrase, or sound that expresses sudden or strong feelings. These are going to be words like, oh, wow, darn, ouch, or ugh. And you always use a comma or commas, whether that interjection is at the beginning, middle, or end of a sentence. Here's your example. Ooh, she's going to the party? Awesome, then we have to go. She just always makes everything more fun. We're going, seriously. I'm going to slow that down and throw a little vocal fry on it and show you where all those different interjections are. Ooh, she's going to the party? Awesome. Then we have to go. She just always makes everything more fun. We're going, seriously. That hurt. That actually hurt me. Notice that when the introduction is at the beginning of a sentence or at the end, you use one comma, and if it's in the middle, you use two. Rule number 9, last rule, use a comma in direct address. Direct address means you are specifically talking to a person or people, and whether you're talking to a single person or many people, you use a comma to set apart the name or the names, like this. Joshua, you are the best. So it's Joshua, comma, you are the best. Or, I totally understand comma usage now, Mrs. Day. You use a comma to set apart the name that's using a comma in direct address. That is it. Those are Mrs. Day's easy comma rules. Some of you are stressed out right now because there are 9 instead of a nice round 10. I told you at the beginning, these are not all of the comma usage rules. Here are the sources I used to make my list. If you're interested in learning more or doing more research, these are resources I would point you to. If you have a specific question for me, please email me or leave a comment down in the comments. Thank you so much. Now get to work.